The last several weeks have been kind of, not intentionally, but thematically talking about sort of the difficult questions. Why is life so hard? Some of the deeper mysteries of life. I've ruined riding bicycles for several people. I'm very sorry about that. If you didn't hear that homily, don't go back to it. It's been very upsetting to many people. I'm not the physicist. It wasn't my theory. That's all I have to say about that. But I know many are like, oh, thank goodness, a new season, Advent. He's got to move to a new theme. But as the prophet Elmer Fudd said, Zoe, this theme's going to stick around. And that gospel sure points it out, doesn't it? Some people want to take the apocalyptic stuff and just apply it to some weird, like, sci-fi movie ending and miss the reality that Jesus is saying the imminent tribulation is just as much waiting in line at the store as it is some weird, apocalyptic, the sky ripping apart and fire and brimstone coming down. Because if you can't recognize the waiting there, you wouldn't recognize it if indeed the sky were to rip open and strange things were to happen as he described it. That's just how it works. Catherine of Siena once said, if you can't find heaven on earth, you wouldn't recognize it if it bit you in the rump. Slight cleaning that up for church. She was very colorful, Catherine. She's not wrong, is she? If you can't find heaven here, if everything you see is just glass half empty, how on the earth would you ever see it as half full? How would you even recognize full? And so the work for us is waiting. Sorry, again, especially in a culture that things are so instant. Not just instant product, although that's a huge piece of it. I was in Houston a couple weekends ago for the Lingap Center's Board of Governors meeting, and of course, now you can get internet in the air, right? I mean, just go back a few years, you think of I remember when my brother-in-law was telling me about the idea of wireless internet, and I remember what I said. I'm one of those morons that will go down in history, is saying, well, that's just not even possible, Brian. That's just not even possible. Well, there's a lot of things that just because I don't know them doesn't mean they're impossible. And so here now we have internet in the air, but it's not fast enough, is it? It just isn't. We don't like it. We just don't like waiting. And the thing about Advent waiting is it's kind of fun because it's finite. We know where it ends. Somebody anonymously sent me, better not been one of you, an Advent calendar. And it's like a little kid's calendar. Maybe it was sent to me by mistake. I don't know. But it did make me laugh. And it did make me stop and think about the very thing I'm preaching to you right now. Is how do I approach Advent, particularly as a priest? I've got all the studies and all this stuff, and let me show you how to wait in Advent. But in that calendar, I kind of held it and thought, oh, if nothing else, this is God going, can you slow down? Could you make every day in this Advent intentional, or are you just going to do it like you did last year, and the year before, and the year before, and the year before? Where you just stayed really busy. And we say in ministry, that's the great trap, right? I'm really busy for Jesus, so that's okay, right? You see, Jesus, I never wanted you to work for me. I just wanted you to love me and follow me. And that's true for all of us. And so you're back to this idea of waiting. And that waiting consecrates the concept into our lives. We have to have it. Quick answers, cheap answers ultimately fall apart. There's an old proverb that says, you can't make the grass grow by pulling on it. But it doesn't stop us from doing it sometimes. Come on. And so here we find ourselves having to think about sometimes the answer that isn't obvious, the waiting for something, that slow waiting without the knowing where it ends. That is where growth comes from. That's where wisdom comes from. You can't short circuit that. You just can't. Nature teaches us that. Pulling the grass grow is kind of a silly example. I've never seen anyone do it, but I'll be honest, I've thought about it. Some of you know I planted trees from seeds at the start of spring. There were days you're like, come on, grow faster. I want you to be bigger by fall. I don't control that. And that was its own teaching moment. That's kind of an obvious one. But what about the difficult things in our lives? There's just so much that nature says you can't. You can't rush that, or what you get is less, or broken, or dead. And so in this season, particularly given all that's happened in the last year and a half, think of the things we didn't know and don't know. It's a whole new lens through which to look at salvation. Otherwise, what is waiting for us? Waiting should ultimately, Pope Francis said this so profoundly a couple of years ago, it still should, this waiting of Advent should still be joyful. I had a friend who, they were driving up from Cincinnati back to Michigan. They asked if they could come to my Saturday Mass, and it didn't work out. But at the end he said, have a blessed Advent. And I wrote back, have an Advent filled with tension, Mark. He's like, that sounds terrible. Yeah, but that's what it is. That's our season. But it should be filled with joy. But it won't be filled with joy if we don't believe with every ounce of our being. If we don't trust that what we're waiting for is worth it. That's why it has to be a personal relationship with our God. You can't wait with trust for the creed on paper. You just can't. You can't give intellectual assent to the tension of our lives. Whatever that tension is, the expectant mother, the wondering what's going on in our world. You can't wait in those tensions with joy for words, except for the Word made flesh. The Word that will save us, that this whole season kicks off our salvation history. And so we bring today our tension, our waiting, the things we don't know, the things we don't understand. And we just lay them right out in front of ourselves and say, with joy, I have hope, as you saw on the screen, and I trust that the one that took flesh, that takes flesh, will bring it all together. Because he always has, and he always will. Christ yesterday, today, and forever. That's difficult to do. And that's why the gospel is saying it. People running around, you're not going to be spared from it, he said. It's not like you're going to stand there with some shield over you. We have the tension. We have the waiting without knowing. We don't know the date, the hour. See how it all comes together. And the difficult questions I've been talking about for the last several weeks, they don't go away. But as I said sometimes, that the answer that becomes less important because in the waiting, we find ourselves with a deeper insight, with a deeper wisdom, something to share with others who are doing the same thing, who maybe feel like they're just keeping their head above water. We have something to share, which isn't a cheap, quick answer. It is an overnight delivery. It's an infant born in a barn. It's the God that comes to us as the Prince of Peace. And I hope in that. And hope is not optimism. I trust in that because I've experienced it in my life. But even in the midst of great consternation, great tension around waiting, and I got my share right now just like you do, I believe in that with every fiber of my being. And as I often point out, in just a few minutes, he's going to give us his presence in the Eucharist. As he renews his promise to us, you will never be without me. You will never be alone. And in the midst of all that we bring to this liturgy, in the midst of all we will take from here when we leave, the Prince of Peace, Emmanuel, God with us, we need to practice that in this season. And so right at the beginning, at the kickoff of the game, let us call that to mind. And then prepare our hearts to receive him in the real presence. To always be reminded that God is with us. May God be praised.